DNS Part 3. Well, this nugget is Part 3 of DNS, and here we'll start off with discussing how to resolve names. I mean, we can already resolve downwards in the namespace to child domains using delegations or using stub zones. But how about resolving upwards in the namespace if you're on a domain that's lower in the namespace? For example, from the child up to the parent. Also, how to resolve out to perhaps the internet. So we'll take a look at how we can use ISPs, DNS servers, or something like that for other kinds of resolution. Then we'll also take a look at Active Directory replication. Now, this is not really an Active Directory nugget, nor is it an Active Directory series, but there are certain parts of Active Directory that are inescapable in terms of DNS, because you actually have to have DNS to use Active Directory, and they're very interdependent upon one another. Then we'll take a look at a useful tool called RepelMon, and this does a lot of Active Directory stuff for us as well, and in particular, we're just going to use it for the time being to show us some Active Directory information, and we'll use it in the next nugget as well in more detail. Then we'll look at the Active Application Directory partitions, and there's a couple of those that already exist. One of those is the domain DNS zones, and the other one is the forest DNS zones, which contain replicated information to the forest or the domain in terms of DNS information. And then we'll also look at how you can create your own custom application directory partitions. Well, in this nugget, we're talking about DNS, but we've already covered quite a lot about DNS in previous nuggets. So I think it'd be a good opportunity right now to just kind of catch us up to where we are to get to the State of the Union or the State of the DNS address here. First of all, we've got DC Nugget 1, which is the domain controller for NuggetLab.com. Since it's got DNS installed on it, when I promoted it to NuggetLab.com, it automatically gave itself an Active Directory integrated zone for NuggetLab.com. And of course, DNS is critical. In fact, you can't even have Active Directory without DNS. So that's how important it is. Then we also had DC Nugget 2, which is a peer domain controller in the same domain for NuggetLab.com. Since I had DNS installed on it, it also automatically got a copy of that zone for NuggetLab.com. DC Nugget 3 is a separate domain. It's a child domain for Tucson.NuggetLab.com. Additionally, when we installed it, it created a subdomain under NuggetLab.com up here on DC Nugget 1 because DC Nugget 3 had pointed to DC Nugget 1 in its IP configuration properties. Well, later on we decided to go ahead and create its own zone down here, and we also created a delegation initially up here in DC Nugget 1, then we changed it to what you see right now, which is a stub zone for Tucson.NuggetLab.com, the advantage being that it automatically updates. In fact, it automatically picked up the fact that I added an additional name server on DC Nugget 4 for that same zone, and here we have a secondary zone for Tucson.NuggetLab.com. Now then, let's go ahead and take a look at a problem that's kind of been left behind by all of this. You see, DC Nugget 1 has no problem resolving Tucson.NuggetLab.com, and neither does DC Nugget 2 because Tucson.NuggetLab.com as a stub zone, as you recall, was set up so it would replicate to all DNS servers in the domain. And in fact, DC Nugget 2 is in the same domain, so therefore it gets the same copy, and there it is. DC Nugget 4 doesn't have any problem resolving Tucson.NuggetLab.com because it's got the secondary. So what we really have a problem with here is resolving on DC Nugget 3 back up the tree to NuggetLab.com. And in fact, here I've gone to Remote Desktops, and Remote Desktops is on your Administrative Tools Start menu, and you can just add or remove desktops to this by right-clicking and choosing Adding a New Connection, and you enter in the IP address or the server name that you want, followed by the credentials. Once you've done that, you just click OK, and that's what I've done here to add all of these servers. Now, in this case, I'll just click on DC Nugget 3, and it shows it to me in a remote desktop kind of a fashion that you see here. And then all I want to do is to be able to find DC Nugget 1 to perform things like Active Directory replication, because there will be some replication that needs to take place there. Now, the typical tool that we'll use, and again, it's kind of a fine line because it's not really an Active Directory nugget or series. However, there's a lot of things that integrate with DNS relating to Active Directory. So we'll go ahead and cover this part. We go to Active Directory sites and services, which you can use to do replication back and forth between your domain controllers in the forest. And then after waiting a good while, which I kind of paused the recording to wait for this, we get this big message. Oh, this big red X. Great. Don't you just love the big red X's? Domain does not exist or could not be contacted. Contact your system administrator. Wish I knew who that was. Alright, so anyway, it still pops it open, but it doesn't really give me anything to work with here. Well, what's the problem? It's a DNS problem. You see, I've already worked everything out so that we can have all these other servers, DC Nugget 1, DC Nugget 2, and DC Nugget 4, contact hosts in Tucson.NuggetLab.com because we got stub zones here that are replicated in Active Directory, and we got a secondary zone down here in DC Nugget 4. So everybody's able to get to Tucson, but from Tucson, from this domain, on this domain controller, we cannot move back up the hierarchy to NuggetLab.com. Is it because DC Nugget 3 has no zones for NuggetLab.com, has no capability for working with NuggetLab.com right now? And in fact, we can confirm that another way as well if we go back to our remote desktops over here. If I can get the window back, there we go. And I'm just going to open up a command prompt to take a look at that. So we'll go down here to open a command prompt, and I'll try to ping DC Nugget 1 by name, by fully qualified domain name, and press enter, and it can't get it because it's not able to resolve the name. So we definitely have an issue here. Well, the way this is going to be resolved is by going to the server, DC Nugget 3 in DNS here, and right-clicking here, choosing Properties, and then I'm going to go to the Forwarders tab. Now, I'm going to address all these other tabs in good time here, but bear with me for the time being, and let's just go right to the Forwarders tab, and I'll explain what this is about. This allows me to forward any queries that this DNS server can't resolve out of itself, out of its own zones, to forward them to other locations. For example, what you might do is, you might forward all other DNS domains that you can't resolve out of this DNS server to, for example, your ISP's DNS server, 68.15.2.30 or whatever it happens to be. So you then would click on Add, and that way, any other internet queries or anything that I can't query out of this DNS server would go directly to this DNS server. So that's one implementation that you could use there. Another thing you can do, and this is going to address our current situation, is I could click New, and I could do what's called conditional forwarding. This is new with Windows Server 2003. And then I would say, anytime a client tries to look for NuggetLab.com, any item in NuggetLab.com's domain, any resource records there, then we're going to send them right to an authoritative name server for that zone. So it would be 10.10.10.20 in this case. And it doesn't have to be the authoritative name server. It could also be, well, I guess I cleared all that out. It could also be just any other server that would be able to eventually get to a NuggetLab.com DNS server. Okay, 10.10.10.20, we add that in. Now, I could also choose to not use recursion for the NuggetLab.com domain. That means that if it can't resolve it by hitting this server, then it's not going to go back out and hit its other methods, such as going to root hints and going to the top-level domain, or going to the root servers on the internet, and then the top-level domains, and then going all the way down through all of that to get to NuggetLab.com. Because it wouldn't make any sense to go through all that recursion right now, because this is a private domain. It's only within my company right now. It's not out there on the public internet, so those root hint servers would have no knowledge of it anyway. Now, another thing to consider here is, for NuggetLab.com, if I have multiple DNS servers that are able to host that, I could add another one in there. For example, remember, DC Nugget 2 is also a DNS server that's Active Directory Integrated Domain Controller here. So I could go ahead and enter in its IP address, 10.10.10.22, and add that in. And then what would happen is, first it'll try the top one in the list. After 5 seconds of timing out, it goes to this next one. And that will help to give us a little bit of fault tolerance and redundancy here as well. Which, of course, is another good reason to have another peer domain controller that's Active Directory integrated as well. So now I'll just click OK, and then I'm going to go back to my DC Nugget 3, where I'll return to a command prompt and clear everything out in terms of its caches. So we clear all of that out, and this time we're going to go ahead and try to ping DC Nugget 1 again and see if we get a better result. And then having run ping, it does give me successful replies here, so we're pretty happy about that. Now let's just go ahead and also take a look at Active Directory sites and services from this domain controller and see if we can actually get our replication to get back and forth here. So I'll go to, actually did open, so we see that's good news, right? Didn't get the big red X this time. Go down to default first site name, which is, right now, even though in my diagrams they're all in different sites, we haven't actually moved them away from the first site right now. By default, Active Directory sites and services in Active Directory puts all of your servers in the same site. Later on, we may decide to move them into differently named sites, such as Tucson and Benson and the like. But in any case, here I've got DC Nugget 3, and my main concern right now is the fact that I want to make sure that it can replicate from server 1 to get any updates from server 1. Prior to this time, I wouldn't have been able to replicate, so I'll right-click now and choose Replicate Now. And what do you know, but it says it replicated the connections. Everything works just fine. Let's just try it with this one too, just in case. Okay, everything's looking good there. And all of our replication now works. Also, let me just point out a shortcut for replication if you want as well. There's a lot of right-clicking to do in Active Directory sites and services. And although it's a little bit outside of our current topic, let me show you a quick way to do that as well from a command prompt. You can use a command called repadmin, do repadmin, / sync all, to sync all Active Directory partitions with all of its partners. Press enter, and it gets success for all of these. So all these synchronized all of these Active Directory domain controllers with no errors. So now back here, let's just go ahead and summarize what we do to work our way up and down the hierarchy. To work our way down the hierarchy from top-level domain of nuggetlab.com to tucson.nuggetlab.com, you can create either delegations, or better off yet would be a stub zone, which we could also store in Active Directory so that it replicates automatically to other domain controllers if we want. And then to work our way up the hierarchy, if we're in the child domain, to work our way up to nuggetlab.com, we can put in a conditional forward. Now also, there is another method that I could have used to be able to do that, and that would be this nuggetlab.com zone. Notice that if I right-click on it and choose properties, that it's replicating to all DNS servers in the Active Directory domain of nuggetlab.com. See, I could have changed that to the Active Directory forest. I'm going to cancel that, but that's what I could have chosen. And if I did, then that would replicate to DC Nugget 3 because it's a child domain in the same forest. Therefore, since it's part of the same forest, it would have automatically gotten through replication a nuggetlab.com zone. Now, what I would have had to also do, at least temporarily, is to point DC Nugget 3 through its TCP/IP properties to DC Nugget 1 and then perform replication so that I could get that zone down here in DC Nugget 3 because prior to that, there's no way of it being able to find nuggetlab.com to even perform the replication, which is the same problem we had before we created our forwarder. In this case, I've chosen to go ahead and use just the forwarder because I don't want to do the zone transfer for the entire nuggetlab.com zone. I just want to put my queries up to nuggetlab.com, and that's why I used a conditional forwarder. Let's also take a look at how that practically actually looks in Active Directory, and we can use a tool called RepLmon, which is a support tool, to take a look at that. Here what you simply do is you add monitored servers by right-clicking and choosing an add a monitored server. Then you can add a server explicitly by name, or you can look for it. I'll just enter in DC Nugget 1, for example, and then finish. And then we see that it includes all the information for DC Nugget 1 in terms of its Active Directory data. Now, let me show you another thing you can do with this, and I'm just going to do this instead. Once you've done that, you've added the server in, you can save the monitored list, and you can give it a specific name. I'd already done that for DC Nugget 1. In my case, however, I'm going to actually go ahead and open another script that I'd already saved, and that was all of my domain controllers, and since I've already got that, I guess I'll have to close it. There we go. And now we have DC Nugget 1, DC Nugget 2, and DC Nugget 3 all on the same list. Now then, that zone that we had for nuggetlab.com, that's stored in the Active Directory partition of DC equals domain DNS zones nuggetlab.com. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. It shows the members that are going to get the domain DNS zones. That's DC Nugget 1, and it's also DC Nugget 2. Now then, if by chance this domain DNS zones or the forest DNS zones ever gets corrupt or something like that or deleted for some reason, then you can fix that one of two ways. Number one, you can go to a command line, and this again is a DNSCMD command. Remember, you can do just about anything in DNS with DNSCMD. And then you got to do a / look at this, create built-in directory partitions. Couldn't they have made that any shorter? Anyway, we got to do that, and then you follow it with whichever scope you want it to do for. If you want to do it for the domain partition, then you just type in domain, as you would guess. Of course, this already failed. This fails because it already exists. Also, you can do it for the forest, but that'll also fail since that's already existent, and it's not corrupt or missing or anything like that. Lastly, I can also do all domains, and that will attempt to fix that on all domains in the forest. And we have problems with that as well because, again, this stuff already exists. But if you do have problems with it, you go to the command line and you do that. Now, the other thing you could do is you could go to your DNS management console, and if you had the corrupt partition up here on DC Nugget 1, then I could right-click here, and then I would choose Create Default Application Directory Partitions, and then it would ask me if I want to replicate that single partition for DNS zone data to all other DNS servers in the Active Directory domain of nuggetlab.com, and I say yes, and then it is unable to do it again because the partition already exists. Then you can also do the same thing for the forest. And the way you'll do that is to right-click again and choose Create Default Application Directory Partitions, and this time we'll say no to the first question, and then it'll pop up asking us if we want to do it for the forest instead of the domain, which was the first one, and then we'll say yes. In this case, again, it'll fail because it already all exists, so we're okay with that. Now, in addition to the domain DNS zones, I might also want to create custom application directory partitions, and I might use this to use with DNS so that I can have specific data that's replicated between specific DNS servers, and that might be because I have a specific application that needs to use that information out of the DNS zones. But I don't want to replicate it to all my DNS servers. I just want to do it to specific ones, and in that case, to create a custom directory partition, you go DNSCMD followed by the name of the server, and if I'm actually at the local server. I don't have to type that in. I just did it for good measure here, even though I'm on DC Nugget 1. Then / create directory partition, and then you type in whatever you want the fully qualified domain name of the special directory partition to be. In this case, I'll say app1.nuggetlab.com and press enter. And then we see that it created the partition successfully. The next thing I need to do is to specify which server, in this case DNS, DC Nugget 2, I want to be able to also replicate with that app1.nuggetlab.com data. And to do that, I'll do DNS-CMD DC Nugget 2 / enlist directory partition, followed by the same fully qualified domain name, and press enter. Now quickly returning over here to DC Nugget 1 in the DNS console, notice that underneath nuggetlab.com now I do indeed have this app1, which points to both DC Nugget 1, that's its IP address, and DC Nugget 2 for these host records. And if I go down to DC Nugget 2 again, I see also app1 down here as well. Now let me also point out that once we've created these custom directory partitions, application directory partitions, you can now go to any other property within Active Directory that is a zone that replicates, and I can specify that I want it to replicate to a different scope. So if I can right-click on this, for example, choose its properties, then I can change its properties in replication here. And now this bottom portion becomes available to me, and I can specify that I want that to replicate within app1.nuggetlab.com. And now I return to RepelMon over here, and I see that after having refreshed the screen using the F5 key on my keyboard, it now shows up with app1.nuggetlab.com on DC Nugget 1, and it replicates also to DC Nugget 2 for app1.nuggetlab.com as well. Now later on, if I decide we don't want that anymore, we're not using this application that stores information in this portion of the DNS server anymore, and we don't want it on DC Nugget 2, then I simply go back to the command line, type DNS command DC Nugget 2, and then this time it's going to be / unenlist directory partition followed by app1.nuggetlab.com, press enter, and it unenlists it. If I refresh the screen enough times here, you'll see that it disappears from DC Nugget 2 down here now. And having pressed F5, we see that it is indeed now gone. Also, if I want to get rid of it completely, even on DC Nugget 1 over here, then I can do that from the command line as well. And for that, I'll simply type in DNS command DC Nugget 1 and then / delete directory partition followed by the fully qualified domain name. And then it deletes it. And if I go back up here and again refresh my screen, then we'll see that again, once again now it also deletes it from DC Nugget 1. And by the way, you should also know that in order to work with custom application directory partitions, you need to be a member of the Enterprise Admins group. Now, here I'm going to use DNS-CMD again, and this time I'm going to unenlist the directory partition, and then I might do if I'm going to remove this custom application directory partition, we don't need it anymore or something like that, so I'll remove it from that server, and then I need to go ahead and delete it from DC Nugget 1 using this syntax. And that'll be DNS-CMD DC Nugget 1 / delete directory partition followed by the fully qualified domain name. And once I've done that, it deletes it completely. Now we've already seen how it's real convenient to have Active Directory replicate around all of our DNS data. However, what about going back to our standard primary and secondary? What if we had a network change where we wanted to change which servers hosted our primary and secondaries? So for example, here I've got a primary cbtnuggets.com standard zone file, and if we go to its properties, we see that indeed it is a primary zone hosted by this zone file, hosted on this zone file. And then here we have a standard secondary to that primary, again using a zone file. Now what if I want to, in my design change here, make this one a primary? All I have to do is to right click on it, choose properties, and change it from secondary to primary, and click OK and OK. However, that leaves me with a problem because you can't have two primaries. So what I'm going to have to do now is to go up here and to delete my original primary. So now I only have a primary and no secondaries. But that does solve a real simple issue of how you make a secondary then a primary. Now, we'll run into another snag here, however. If I go back up here onto DC Nugget 1, we'll say, you know, our real goal here was just to switch the roles. We want this one to be the primary, and we want a secondary up on DC Nugget 1. So we'll right-click and choose New Zone, and this looks like it'll be pretty simple, just the way we've done this kind of thing in the past. cbtnuggets.com, and we enter in the IP address of what's now the primary, which would be 10.10.10.22 on DC Nugget 2, and I went through that kind of fast because you've seen me do this before. And now we have cbtnuggets.com up here on DC Nugget 1. And if we reload everything and refresh the screen, which I'll do offline here, we'll see that we have all the records. So having refreshed everything, we see that cbtnuggets.com came back just fine. Again, here's our primary, where we have a start of authority record of serial number of 3 with DC Nugget 1 as the primary. And then over here on DC Nugget 1, we also see that DC Nugget 1 is the primary. Wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. The start of authority is supposed to appear on the primary, but I thought I just changed that on DC Nugget 2. Well, first of all, let me just refresh the screen. Whew! Boy, panicked for a minute there. All I had to do was hit F5 to refresh the screen. Sure enough, my primary is DC Nugget 2, where it has the start of authority record. And up here on CBT Nuggets, up here on DC Nugget 1, again, I'll just refresh the screen or hit F5. And no matter how many times I hit it, it seems to still say DC Nugget 1. Uh-oh. What's going on here? Well, this is where you have to be real careful about zone files. You see, we originally had our cbtnuggets.com.dns zone file up here on DC Nugget 1, and when I recreated this, even though it was as a secondary, it has a tendency to pick up the old zone file. So, what am I really reading here? The old zone file, and that's going to give me some puzzling inaccuracies in my zones here. So, what I really need to do at this point is just to delete this, and I'll recreate it offline after I've fixed everything. But then I'll go back through the file system here, go back to Windows, System 32 again, and then we'll go down to DNS. And remember, there it is. There's our DNS file, cbtnuggets.com.dns. That's the old stale information that it was actually loading into the DNS console. So I'm going to delete that. And then now I'll go back here, and offline I'll recreate this for you, and we'll see that it comes up just fine. Now, before I finish that, let me also point out another issue you should be aware of here. If I go down to a zone that used to be a secondary that I converted to a primary, like I did this one on DC Nugget 2, and I go to its properties, I look at the name servers tab and everything looks like it's in order. But be careful, because when you convert from a secondary to a primary, it sets the zone transfer setting to exactly what you see here, which means that it cannot do any zone transfers. So I have to go back and manually make sure that that's configured properly for what we want, for the name servers tab to allow zone transfers to it. And then up here on the forward lookup zones, after having refreshed and transferred everything, now we get the data we want. Now we see it's DC Nugget 2, and everything looks proper again. In this nugget, we continued our discussion of DNS, and this was part 3. And we started off reminding ourselves of how we resolved names downwards in the namespace from nuggetlab.com to tucson.nuggetlab.com. But we also have to be able to resolve from hostintucson.nuggetlab.com upwards in the namespace to nuggetlab.com, and we'll use conditional forwards for that, as we saw. We also saw that we sometimes need to resolve all other DNS names, and that'll often be the case for internet resolution, where you might be able to use your ISP's DNS server, where you can take advantage of names that are already cached by other parties. We also took a look at Active Directory replication, and although this is not really an Active Directory nugget or series, there are certain parts that are inescapable because they're interdependent upon one another. That is Active Directory and DNS. One of the tools that you can use to track that replication, particularly in our case with DNS information, is a tool called RepelMon, and we saw how to get started using that. Also, we're going to use RepelMon more in the upcoming nugget, the next nugget. We also took a look at application directory partitions, and there's a couple of them there by default. One of them is the domain DNS zones. The other one is the forest DNS zones. And we also saw how you can create your own custom application directory partitions. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.